Welcome to All Things Considered, where we rate movies not just on how they turned out, but also on how they got there. We score each film out of 10 in 3 categories: the quality of the movie itself, the behind-the-scenes drama among the cast and crew, and the film's production woes, from studio meddling to on-set disasters. Then we average it all out for a final score that reflects not just the movie on screen, but the wild story of how it was made. Today we're taking a look at Fantastic Four, the 2015 reboot that was supposed to revive Marvel's first family and prove that Fox could compete with the MCU. With director Josh Trank coming off his breakout hit Chronicle, the studio hoped his darker, grounded approach would reinvent the franchise. But Trank was inexperienced, in over his head, and quickly lost the studio's confidence while he feuded with his cast. As production spiraled, Fox took control and pushed Trank to the side, reshaping the movie and reshoots he had little say in. The result was a film that felt disjointed, joyless, and somewhat rushed and unfinished. So let's dive in and see how this film truly scores with All Things Considered. First, let's take a look at the film's production woes. At the time, the film rights to Fantastic Four were owned by Fox, not Marvel Studios, and the licensing deal came with a catch. If Fox didn't keep producing new movies within a certain time frame, the rights would automatically revert back to Marvel. With Rise of the Silver Surfer coming out in 2007, that clock was running out fast. By 2014, Fox wasn't just developing another reboot, they were racing against a legal deadline to keep control of the franchise. In other words, Fantastic Four 2015 wasn't born out of creative passion or a bold new vision, it was greenlight because the studio was desperate not to lose the rights. However, the director they hired to helm the project, Josh Trank, did have a vision. Inspired by horror director David Cronenberg's films like The Fly and Scanners, Trank wanted to make a film that explored the grotesque body horror behind the team's transformations, from turning invisible and fading from existence to being trapped in a body of stone, consumed by uncontrollable flames, or warped and stretched beyond human form. On paper, it was a bold, even brilliant concept, but it was the complete opposite of what both Fox wanted and what the Fantastic Four had always represented: hope, family, and fun. In fact, Trank may have been better served by just taking this idea and doing another original superhero film like Chronicle, where he'd had the freedom to do what he wanted, especially since he wasn't even very familiar with the Fantastic Four to begin with. And since he was unfamiliar with Marvel's first family, Trank brought in screenwriter Jeremy Slater, a self-proclaimed comic book fan eager to stay faithful to the source material. Slater shared his favorite Fantastic Four issues from his personal collection with Trank, hoping to spark ideas, but Trank showed little interest. According to Slater, Trank also controlled communication with the studio, refusing to let him meet with Fox directly and filtering which drafts or notes were passed along. Out of roughly 18 drafts and 2,000 pages of material that Slater wrote, most never reached the studio, and 95% of their feedback never made it back to him. Eventually, Slater left the project, as Fox brought in its own writers to try and get the script ready for filming. When it came time to cast the film, Trank wanted to reimagine the Storm family as black, casting a black Sue, Johnny, and Franklin Storm, but the idea reportedly led to what were described as uncomfortable debates about race with the studio. In the end, Fox let him cast 2 black actors as Johnny and Franklin, but Trank said he faced a lot of pushback when he tried to cast a black actress as Sue. Fox insisted on Kate Mara, fresh off her success in House of Cards, believing she had more mainstream appeal. Fox also pushed back on Trank's decision to cast Miles Teller as Reed Richards, but eventually the director won out. By this point, the studio began to lose confidence in Trank and decided to slash the film's budget by tens of millions right before filming began, forcing major changes across the board. Trank later revealed that most of the planned spectacle-filled finale was scrapped, with the studio deciding to figure out the ending later during reshoots. As a result, Trank began filming without knowing what the movie's third act would even be, which is no way to make a movie. Regardless, once Fox saw an early cut of the film, they were horrified by its grim tone and even more concerned that it didn't look and feel much like a superhero movie. Panicking, they bring in X-Men writer-producer Simon Kinberg and World War Z's Drew Goddard, who had famously rewritten that film's third act during reshoots, alongside veteran editor Stephen Rifkin, whom Trank described as the de facto director. Trank later said it was like being castrated, as he would arrive on set with producers already blocking out scenes without him and an editor deciding what shots to get. Adding to the chaos, several key actors weren't even available for the reshoots. Toby Cabell, who played Dr. Doom, later claimed he appears on screen as the masked villain only a handful of times, with a stand-in filling in for most of the final scenes due to scheduling conflicts. Even Kate Mara had already moved on to another project and cut her hair short, forcing her to wear a distractingly obvious wig during the reshoots. So where does this land on a scale from 1 to 10 for production woes? Well, Fantastic Four became the cinematic equivalent of a creative cuckold. A director for... A director forced to watch someone else take over his film while he stood by powerless. Josh Trank was, in all but name, fired, allowed to remain on set during reshoots with no authority as writers, producers, and editors worked to save his movie. By then, he'd lost nearly all creative control over a project he never seemed fully invested in to begin with. The production went forward without a finished ending, the budget was cut, key actors weren't available during reshoots, and the final film felt rushed and incomplete, as if everyone involved just wanted to wrap it up and move on. It's a textbook case of a studio in panic and a filmmaker way out of his depth. On the production Woes scale, this one's a 9.8 out of 10, a complete implosion that stands as one of the most disastrous comic book productions ever made. Now let's score the behind-the-scenes drama, because for a movie about Marvel's first family, things on set were anything but familial. Trank became increasingly controlling during filming, allegedly directing his actors down when to blink and when to breathe, in an effort to maintain the flat, joyless tone he wanted. Miles Teller pushed back hard. His sarcasm and second-guessing of Trank's direction allegedly led to shouting matches that nearly turned physical, with the two reportedly standing chest to chest, daring each other to throw the first punch. Ironically, Trank had fought the studio to cast Teller in the first place, a decision he probably regretted almost immediately. Trank also took out his frustrations on Kate Mara, who he'd been forced to cast over his objections and desire for the Storm family to be all black. Cast members recalled his treatment of her as cold and dismissive, while Mara herself later described the experience as miserable and the worst time she's ever had working with the director. During production, Trank slept with a gun on his nightstand, gripped by growing paranoia after receiving a barrage of online death threats over his decision to race swap Johnny Storm. Once production wrapped, he returned the gun, but the paranoia and pressure had already taken their toll. Then there's the bizarre incident involving Trank and his dogs, who were accused of causing nearly $100,000 in damage to a Baton Rouge home rented for him by Fox during filming. When the landlord tried to evict him, things reportedly escalated. Trank allegedly defaced photos of the landlord's family in retaliation. The situation got so out of hand that allegedly Fox CEO and chairman Jim Giannopoulos personally flew to Louisiana to apologize to the landlord and smooth things over. Just days before the film's release, Trank sent an email to the cast and crew expressing pride in their work, believing Fantastic Four was better than 99% of comic book movies ever made. Sorry, I'm trying not to laugh at that. One cast member reportedly replied bluntly, "I don't think so." Then, on the eve of the film's premiere, as brutal early reviews began pouring in, Trank took to Twitter, writing that he'd once had a fantastic version of the movie that audiences would never see, essentially disowning the film. But Hollywood is a small town, and word of his erratic on-set behavior had already reached Lucasfilm, where he had been developing a Boba Fett spin-off. Before they could fire him, Trank abruptly quit. So where does this land out of 10 for behind-the-scenes drama? Trank feuded with Miles Teller, made Kate Mara's experience miserable, and grew so paranoid that he slept beside a loaded gun during filming. On the behind-the-scenes drama scale, this one earns a 9.4 out of 10. Bad, but not quite as bad as something like Justice League. As for the movie itself, Fantastic Four feels less like a finished film and more like a rough cut that accidentally made it to theaters. The pacing is rushed, characters barely develop, and the story leaps forward with entire scenes seemingly missing. Dr. Doom, one of Marvel's most iconic villains, is reduced to a hollow afterthought. The tone is dark, dour, and joyless, completely at odds with the adventurous, family-driven spirit that defines the Fantastic Four. There are hardly any memorable set pieces either, and the few action moments that exist feel less than for a big-budget superhero film. It's visually dull, emotionally empty, and it's not even fun to hate watch. By the time the finale arrives, it's over almost as soon as it begins, a short, anticlimactic battle that feels like the movie is just racing to be over. On the film quality scale, this one earns a 5.1 out of 10. Not offensively bad, just boring and lifeless. A movie so drained of energy, it barely feels like anyone wanted to make it. And when you know the backstory, with Fox only doing it to hold on to the rights and Trank not even really being a fan, you realize nobody actually did. However, when you factor in the studio sidelining the director, the endless reshoots, and the friction and abuse behind the scenes, all things considered, Fantastic Four 2015 rises to an 8.1 out of 10. Normally, considering how much the studio meddled, I'd label this a textbook certified studio screwjob. However, once you realize how in over his head Trank was, this gets downgraded to our lowest honor, a Hollywood dumpster fire. Alright, that's my score, but what about you guys? Let me know in the comments below what score you'd give Fantastic Four, all things considered. Thanks for watching everybody, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more of Hollywood's untold stories and unmade movies.